Are you passionate about shaping India's future? Keen to find solutions for India's most pressing challenges? Look no further than Takstashila's postgraduate program in public policy. This 48-weekend program will equip you with the knowledge, skills, and network needed to pivot to a meaningful career in public policy. Apply in the link below by June 1st. The program begins June 20th. Hope to see you there.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Should the US sell advanced AI chips to China? This is a question that has animated US policy, industrial, technological, and political circles for years now. There are essentially two sides of this debate. One side that says, go on and sell to China as much as you want because you'd want China to remain dependent and logged in to the US ecosystem so that they can never really innovate to the cutting edge. The other side plays up the national security implications of what selling these advanced GPU chips to China entails. So which side is right? Wait, let me add another angle to it and rephrase this question. Which side is right for India? Which pathway on this issue works for Indian interests? Hi, I'm Lokendra Sharma, a tech geopolitics researcher with Takshashila. To unpack answers to these very convoluted questions and really, see through this debate, I have with me Pranay Kotasthane, who chairs high-tech geopolitics program that Takshashila has, and also brings in a blend of experience in semiconductor industry and also deep policy understanding. He has recently authored an issue brief on the theme of today's podcast. Welcome, Pranay. So, and before we really answer the two questions that I posed, maybe for the benefit of our listeners, if you could just unpack some developments that have unfolded in the last few years during Biden's days in White House to Trump's days in the White House now, as to how US has approached China on the chips front. Sometimes they sold them the chips, sometimes they backtracked and imposed bans. So can you walk us through some of these ups and downs?
Yeah. Hi, Loki. So just to give a quick background, NVIDIA's GPUs are used extensively for training the LLMs. So that's why they are really crucial. And they are the only GPUs which work and scale really well for training models which have large parameters. So that's why this is a crucial choke point which exists in this supply chain. So starting 2022, the US government started using this as a geopolitical leverage. So in October 2022, the Biden administration had imposed some export controls that restricted China's access to advanced AI chips, such as NVIDIA's A100 at that time. Then in October 2023, these were broadened to cover chips built on the same architecture. So not just A100, but similar other chips. In response to that, NVIDIA created something called the H20. So there were some thresholds that the US government had set that beyond these flops, you can't sell to China without a license. So NVIDIA made a special chip called H20, which technically and legally complied with all these restrictions. It was just below the threshold and it continued selling to China. So that again brought some eyeballs onto NVIDIA's strategy in the US national security circles that NVIDIA was sort of gaming the system, whereas I think it was perfectly following what the US government was doing, right? By the way, I don't own any NVIDIA shares or I don't have any connection with them, but I'm just looking at it from an analyst perspective. So this was the current status that H20s were getting sold, but there was a pushback against H20 sales as well. In April 2025, then the Trump administration came in and then it even banned this compliant H20. And it seems that it cost NVIDIA around 5.5 billion right down because of unsold inventory. In July 2025, it reversed this move. Okay, so and that's just 3 months down the line, and it allowed H20 cells to resume after Jensen Huang, etc., said that this is not working out, and there were also the trade negotiations with Beijing that Trump government did. Now, after this was done, it was China's turn to put restrictions. So it instructed companies, including the big ones like ByteDance, Alibaba, and Tencent, to halt these H20 purchases, saying that there might be security concerns and potential backdoors. Then by August 2025, Nvidia asked its suppliers to suspend H20 production because no one was buying them. In Jan 2026, Trump announced a new arrangement, and it said that Nvidia could sell the more powerful H200, not just H20, H200, to approved Chinese customers, but it will get a hafta, right? The US government will charge a 25% surcharge. So it's technically a hafta. Then by Feb 2026, the US government had approved the sale of a small number of H200s to China. But it was unclear whether Chinese regulators would approve the imports or not.
Yeah.
And this conversation kept on going, and it was also discussed in the recent Trump-Xi meeting, where Jensen Huang was part of the delegation that Trump brought along with him. So this is the status. What you can see through all this is that these advanced GPUs have become important conversation in geopolitics. Whether GPUs flow to China or not from the US is not just a conversation which is taking place in Nvidia's boardrooms, but it is a conversation that animates many security analysts as well. And like you mentioned, there are differing views on this. So it's not a settled debate. It still continues, and the benefits of either side are not well understood, or benefits or costs either.
No, so I think few things stand out from your response, Pranay. First is, so when I was following this development closely last year, I remember when the S20 was first banned, I thought, oh, this is a great sign of US-China tech rivalry heating up. And maybe that will define the remainder of Trump's term. Because I recollected what happened in Trump's first term, where Huawei and ZTE and a bunch of others got caught in the crossfire of US-China tech competition. And I thought AI chips and a bunch of other issues is going to define the second term. But then he backtracked, right? And then we are seeing a series of back and forths that the US has done. So in some ways, I felt this whole chip thing reflects or sort of mirrors the broader US-China relationship, right? The way US-China relationship has fluctuated in the last 1 year or so with trade, with tariffs, with chips, with critical minerals. And it was not really an aberration that way. So the broader US-China relationship had an impact and vice versa. So what do you think about that? That is one. And second observation I have is, during Trump's first stint in White House, when we used to talk about US-China tech competition, it was mostly US as the actor and China as a recipient. US is doing XYZ, US is taking this action, US is banning Huawei, US is instituting this export control, that entity list, so on and so forth. In Trump's second term, we see some shifts, right? We are seeing China also becoming a protagonist in all of this, as in not just a recipient, but also initiating actions. They did what they did with critical minerals last year, and also the reports that came out of China that they are telling companies within China that you really don't have to use Nvidia chips. So the reports indicated that discouraging the use of these chips. And then we also saw how they have been using their SAMR, that the market regulator.
State Administrator for Market Regulation.
So the way they're using SAMR to also play around with things. So it really felt like they flipped the supply chain warfare script onto the US and increasingly becoming protagonists. So I just want to know your quick views on these two trends.
Yeah, I think both are joined by this idea that we are seeing weaponization of everything happen, right? Again, it's not that it is new, but when you start thinking of these technologies in a zero sum way, that if I have it and if I deny it to others, that's the only way to go ahead. Then you start going down these spirals. And this is what the US did. And then China also responded similarly. So, yeah, it does mirror US China relationship in a way, because this is the primary domain for contestation.
Sure.
Right? There's no, you can't have full scale military warfare, very unlikely because of nuclear weapons. Even full scale economic decoupling is unlikely because there are so many dependencies. Even within technology, decoupling is unlikely. US is still supplying a lot of things to China, right? Lower end chips, lower end machines. Just beyond a certain threshold, their thinking is that if we deny chips beyond a particular threshold, we are okay. But many of the things like machines from Applied Materials or Lam Research, which are semiconductor manufacturing equipment companies, are still going to China because it's a big market. So it's not as if the full decoupling has happened in any sector, but in a limited sense, these areas are seen as having a disproportionate effect on technological power and hence national power going ahead. And that's why the dominant narrative in that is that we should prevent our adversary from having some of these things. And that's what you're seeing taking place.
Okay, so amid all of this flip flops, right? Uh, you have made an argument that restricting advanced GPUs sale to China does not maybe work, and maybe even counterproductive, something on those lines. So, can you explain why you think so? Because the side that plays up the national security threat would say something like, "Oh, we are willingly handing over the best that we have." And they'll use that to build AI capability, embed it in their military, and they will develop defense systems and other things that can then maybe, if not be peer, but can be near peer, which is, and with the scale that China has, they don't necessarily need to be at the cutting edge. They can use near peer technologies, embed them in a very rapidly scaled up ecosystem, and then threaten US interests. That's the argument. How do you beat that argument? What are main points? Why export controls on chips don't work?
Okay, so the first thing is, to answer a question like that, you need to take a perspective in mind, right?
Oh.
So right now we are operating in a world which largely sees this question from a zero sum perspective. So I will also see it from a zero sum perspective. I don't care what it does to US, because that's the US American problem.
Okay.
And let the Americans decide what the best strategy is for them. For me, my concern is what is in India's interest.
Okay.
And we should just look at it from that lens to begin with, right? So what is India's main concern about this, right? So one, if some chips go to China and China continues to release open source models as has been the case, because they want higher adoption of their models, then these models can be disconnected from the underlying hardware, because once you have the open weights available, you can do the inference on other chips, other less capable chips as well. So what is in India's national interest? Is it in India's national interest that there is just one Nvidia as a supplier, which is and the chips don't go to China, and hence China is far behind on this, and there are fewer open source alternatives coming from China? Is that in Indian interest, or more models being there, is that in India's interest? I think it is, for us it is clear that because we don't have a play in those segments, it's not as if we are going to be able to make an AI chip tomorrow. It's going to be taking a long time. It's not as if you are going to be able to break the CUDA monopoly.
Sir, before you proceed further, maybe Pranay, it would be our listeners may find it useful if you can just tell us, where do we exist right now? What are Indian capabilities, leverages, strengths, deficiencies when it comes to semiconductor supply chain?
Yeah, so not just semiconductor supply chain, we'll talk about the AI supply
Yeah,
chain
AI supply
because so we'll again use the NVIDIA analogy. So Jensen Huang always talks about this 5-layer framework
Yeah.
of AI, right?
Yeah.
And the 5 layers are energy, chips, infrastructure, models, and applications.
Hmm.
So let's use that as a framework and see where India is in each of these, right? So what he explains is that each of these layers lies on top of each other, right? First, you need a lot of energy. Energy is used by chips, and through that energy, so you need to plug in those chips in a particular way to get the scale that you want. That's where the infrastructure comes in. Then, based on this stack, you train a model, and once that model has been trained, then you build new applications on top of it. So that's how the entire stack works. Now if you look at this segments, energy is one thing where India is constrained, unlike China where there is abundant energy. There are huge number of new energy sources coming up. So even if they have less capable models, what I like about this layered model is that what he's essentially saying is deficiency in one layer can be compensated by doing better in other layers. So for example, if you don't have good chips but you have abundant energy, you have good infrastructure, it's okay, you will be less efficient but you will be able to still train things. Maybe your training will be slower but you will still be able to do the same things. So anyways, energy is one sector where India doesn't do really well. Our per capita energy consumption is among the lowest, and even though there is a promise for renewables, etc., current regulatory architecture in electricity prevents rapid transition in that, right? And there are many good papers on this about the need for electricity reform, the need for discom reform, the need to see renewables differently from the centralized the grid architectures which were made for coal and other ways which were not decentralized, right? So we are still stuck in that. So we are not going to have energy surplus like China has. So that is one layer in which we are constrained. Second layer is chips. So this energy is finally used by chips. These are those some humongous chips which Nvidia is making, and these chips essentially burn up a lot of energy. That's why you need excellent coolant systems. You need to wire them in interesting ways, etc. That's the third part, infrastructure. But coming to the chips layer, India designs some of these chips, but we have zero commercial manufacturing capability for chips right now. We are getting into the segment for manufacturing, but we have 8 OSAT plants being built, one commercial CMOS fab under construction. But until the next 3-4 years, we are not going to be.
And we are anyway doing trailing edge chips, right? These are all.
These will be 28 nanometer chips. So there's no plan as of now that we will have our own manufactured AI chip in the next 5 years. We can have a AI. We might be like Nvidia, right? Like Nvidia does not make its own chips. Nvidia also finally its chip is made by TSMC.
Yeah.
But it owns the intellectual property.
Correct.
We don't have any such company which makes that complicated chips.
Sure.
But maybe in 5 years, it's not difficult to imagine that some Indian entrepreneur might make a nice inference chip or even a good enough training chip for Fido. But we will not be manufacturing them,
Yeah.
right? So this is where we are in the chips. A related point to that is the chips are not just operating on their own, right? The Nvidia's real moat is the CUDA ecosystem, right? So CUDA essentially is a patchwork of libraries. It's a platform which is used for training these models well on chips, Nvidia chips. So CUDA makes it possible for you to optimize the chip capabilities for your training tasks, for your matrix multiplication, for all the things that LLMs require. So CUDA ecosystem is huge. A lot of the world's AI LLMs have been built by developers over time using CUDA boards, development boards, etc. So it's a lock-in, right? Everyone's working on that. India's engineering engineering workforce is also deeply embedded in the CUDA ecosystem. There are a lot of people who are working in that. And that means we are at least globally competitive. We know how to use it. We know what are its strengths, weaknesses, etc. But it is also a case that we are dependent only on the CUDA ecosystem, right? Now, the entire world is dependent. You don't have an alternate to CUDA as of now. And that's the lock-in which India has on the chips plus software infrastructure. The third layer is infrastructure itself, because these, as I said, they consume a lot of energy. So this layer includes land, power delivery, cooling, networking, because you are going to amass a huge number of chips, plug them together in order to get this kind of capability. That's why you need a lot of good cooling system, especially in a climate like India's, where the weather is hot. So you will actually need advanced cooling systems. You will need to figure out how to reduce water consumption, because we also don't have surplus of that, right? And you want to shift new demand to renewables through better pricing mechanisms. So all these are things you have to do. Currently, our data center capacity is estimated to be around 1.5 gigawatt, which is like an order of magnitude lesser than the US or China. Okay, so we are not doing very well in this segment also, but we can improve. Right, there is scope for improvement. The next one is models, right? So once you have these foundational layers, you are essentially going to be able to train a model. And once you have that model trained and you have done fine tuning, you will release it into the wild. That's what someone like Sarvam has done, right? So they have a 105 billion parameter model which they have released. That's what they call a sovereign AI model. Now, it is these kinds of models in are quite a few now. India also has a model with this Sarvam AI, which was funded. The domestic compute infrastructure for it was funded through the India AI mission, and this model was released in March 2026 with open source weights. Right, so this model exists, and India doesn't do too bad in this, right? Because you have a capable sovereign models. It is not as good as Claude or Chat GPT and things like that, but it is, you have a base capability that you are able to demonstrate and build on top of it, right? Especially this model does well for Indian languages, for certain text to speech tasks, and over time I don't think it's difficult for India to build better models over time, right? So this is the fourth one, right? And finally, it's the application layer. So once you have a LLM model, you need to find applied use cases
Even
for it.
before you answer, I get the impression this is where India might do a lot of things, given its software industry's decades of experience, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So Indian IT firms are positioned to become global delivery vehicle even for enterprise AI deployment, right? You will need, it's not as if companies can quickly shift to AI. We can make prototypes, but in older companies, there are huge processes, digitization that needs to be done. You need to structure the data to be able to use it accurately. All of that will require companies to engage other companies who know this well, right? So this is the enterprise AI segment is where India's strength also lies, and I'm sure we will see a lot of IT services, big companies becoming AI services firms, or new AI services firms emerging, which are taking advantage of this new opportunity that has come up. Right? So generally, these are the picture that emerges is that India is a consumer integrator AI economy. Right, so India consumes chips and models which are produced elsewhere, and it integrates them into data centers, applications, and services.
Yeah.
So it's not that it is like a inherently weak strategy. Given what we have right now, this is a strategy that works well, right? India's IT services exports, for example, are more than Saudi Arabia's oil exports, right? That happened.
Oh wow, that's a great fact.
Yeah, that happened because India has capability in this segment. Sure, you can say we don't own the IP, we don't own, yeah, but and we should build those.
Yeah.
It's not a, but at this stage, we are looking at a situation where we are a consumer integrator, and our calculus is different from the US, which is dominates production at multiple layers, or even China, which is building some indigenous capability across all layers. So what is most important for us at this point is to ensure that we have reliable access across all layers.
Hmm.
Okay, and our leverage point will probably be applications,
Hmm.
and we are not going to gain leverage in any of these against the world, probably in applications if we become
Yeah.
really good in it. But other than that, we want to ensure that we have all these layers available at all times so that we can build great applications on top of it.
Okay. So the impression I get from your response, the overarching impression is we don't do well on most of these layers as of today. Of course, we'd want to do well on all of this, but on application layer is where we have decades of experience and we can actually do things. In model, I think we are doing reasonably okay with server and other things, but there is so much ground to cover. But on the infrastructure bit, chips bit, I think there are severe stressors there. So I think thanks for walking us through these layers. I think this really informs the Indian interest then, right? As you said, the application layer will then maybe to some extent influence what we seek from how global tech contestations happen. So now with that covered, can you state maybe very briefly, maybe point by point, what are the Indian interests?
Yeah. So there are some four considerations that you want to take into account, right? First, American stack is optimal for us, but its access has now become unreliable.
Sure.
Right. So you don't know, Biden administration had an AI diffusion rules
Yeah.
which was rescinded, but Trump also wanted to put something similar.
Hmm.
So it's not difficult to imagine that you might have a situation where your access to a particular chips might be prevented.
Hmm.
So I mean, the way you would want to do that is one, but you don't have other options, right? It's not as if others are making it. So,
Hmm.
given that there are now pack silica and other things, it would be in India's interest to negotiate things that work for it, right, as part of this grouping, and ensure that we get reliable access to this layer. That's the max we can do right now. The second is, you don't want Chinese hardware to be used, but Chinese models are usable, and if their proliferation happens, it is in India's interest, because we are not going to be using Huawei Ascend chips for AI infrastructure in India because they carry significant risks.
Yeah.
You know, what if China denies those chips
Yeah.
to you? And that is more likely to happen than US denying chips to you, because China is your adversary, right? Direct adversary. So, in that sense, you want to ensure that your AI infrastructure and your chips come from US. That's
Hmm.
fine. But the models which China is building, which are open source, there's no problem for India to be able to use them. Right? Essentially, as I mentioned earlier, you can neatly dissociate the underlying hardware from the open weight models that are released, and those open weight models can be used by India, can be used by Brazil, can be used by anyone else, right? And you can even fine tune them. So if there are things which you don't want, which are cognitively trying to influence you from the Chinese perspective, you can fine tune them as well, right? That possibility exists. So ideally, you won't want Indian developers who are at the application layers to have many options, right? You should be able to use DeepSeek, Quen, Kimi K 2.6, or you won't want to be able to use even Anthropic's models, whatever, right? The more the options, the better it is. So this is what is in our interests, and this interest, if Nvidia is giving chips to China, it will have more capable models, and if it does that, you will have more options. More options are in India's interest. It's a simple logic. The other thing here is, the calculus is different for India's defense, intelligence, and critical infrastructure. There you would probably want to have your own models. So there is a case for sovereign models which are specially trained for really critical tasks. And that, as I said, there is a sovereign capability that is being built, so that can work in our interest. The next interest is that CUDA dominance is a bottleneck that we should work to loosen.
Yeah.
That is a crucial bottleneck, because essentially, if you are out of CUDA, you don't have a capable game itself. Now, and that's again something India can do. You know, there is the PyTorch layer which operates above CUDA, but this is where Indian developers do have.
I think at this stage, because some of our listeners might not be very familiar with the semiconductor terminologies involved, right? So if you can simply explain what CUDA and PyTorch is, I think that would be very useful, Pranay.
Yeah. So there are different layers of abstractions through which you can program these GPUs.
Okay.
Right? So one is like you will have a general purpose language. So PyTorch is one layer higher, and using PyTorch you are able to program these GPUs.
Okay.
But you need to go one layer down if you want to optimize for certain things. You sometimes you might want to do matrix multiplication in a particular way that reduces energy consumption.
Okay.
Or you might want to use a specific part of the GPU to accelerate a particular workload. All those kinds of things happen better in CUDA. Right, so you are able to optimize it
So
for
the fine tuning bit.
chips.
Yeah.
Fine tuning is used in different contexts, but notionally you are able to optimize and get better bang for the buck.
Okay.
Right. So now.
And is PyTorch open source?
Yeah, PyTorch is open source.
And CUDA is a lock-in with the NVIDIA ecosystem.
Yes.
Okay.
So ideally, you would want a GPU agnostic middleware, right? So you would want someone to write in PyTorch, and then there is a layer below PyTorch.
So sorry, break down GPU agnostic middleware. That's
GPU agnostic just means whether. So CUDA works really well only with NVIDIA GPUs. If you have an AMD GPU, it won't work well. And that's the lock-in. That's why if you want great performance, you use CUDA and you use an NVIDIA chip. But imagine a situation where whether you have AMD GPU or NVIDIA GPU shouldn't matter. Your workload will run just as good as the other. That's how you will prevent the lock-in. Right? So bunch of companies are already working on this. Apache has a project, and then there is MLIR, ONNX runtime from Microsoft. These are projects which are operating at different layers to make GPU a switchable backend layer. So you should be able to remove a NVIDIA GPU, plug a AMD GPU, and it should be able to work just as good as the NVIDIA. So if you are able to achieve something like this, then you are not dependent just on NVIDIA chip.
Okay.
Right? Then sure, AMD is also an American company, but you have two options instead of one. And both will compete with each other. Maybe at some point of time you might want to use a Chinese chip also, which for non-critical workloads, right? So you need more options in that segment.
Okay.
And that's crucial for India's national interest. The fourth final consideration is just that for a narrow set of applications, we do need sovereign capability. So maybe for defense cases, you don't want to use open models. You will use your own models which are trained specifically on your use cases. Right? So these are the four considerations for India to apply with respect to this question.
I want to zoom out at this stage, and based on the excellent response, Pranay, you have given, at the core of any technological contestation between any power, at this moment it is US and China, is proprietary technologies, because you can only deny to others what you control, right? And that is where I think open source or any kind of open technology comes into play as sort of undercutting logic to all of this, right? You can't confine an open technology to any geography. That's the idea. And that undercuts the very logic of a tech contestation. So if we zoom out of this, I think India is deeply interested, or it is in India's deep interest to promote open technologies, therefore. And not just in software, even hardware, telecom, and other things. That's one, zooming out. And let's say we still end up with proprietary things, because that's the way of the world, right? We will still have innovation happening in private companies that would want to keep their intellectual property in a proprietary state, because that's how they make revenues, right? And we can't do away with that logic. That logic will stay there. And so for that one, India can push for more options, right? So you promote open source, open technologies to undercut proprietary tech, and at the same time, for the remainder of the proprietary tech, you have more options. Is that a good reading of what Indian industry should be, Pranay?
Yeah, see, so as you said, the proprietary options will always be a generation ahead of open options.
Yeah.
Even today, the proprietary models are doing better than the open weight models, right? But that's the question for national power. You don't need to be the number one player in all this, right? You need to have certain base level of capabilities, and if you have that, you can do interesting things in other segments, right? Model is just one segment. You can optimize, like China is being able to do interesting things, optimize models, use mixture of experts and other kind of optimization techniques to get around the restrictions that US has imposed with respect to chips, right? So you can look at compensating for the absence of dominance in one particular layer by doing better in other layers, right? So I would look at open source again from this lens that you will, if there are open models available, it is, the access to it cannot be closed, and that is in India's interest and many other countries' interest. That's why the Indian PM had also mentioned this in the Paris AI Action Summit, that open weight models, or generally used open source models, are in India's interest and something we should encourage, right? They won't be as good as proprietary tech. Fine. I mean, Kimi K 2.6 is still not as good as Cloud Code. But the fact that Kimi K 2.6 exists, the mere fact that it exists and it is capable enough in most segments, prevents NVIDIA from using its leverage. Right?
Also, some of these open source models, because the weight, essentially it means that the weights of these models have been released publicly with billions of parameters, right? They can be then fine-tuned, let's say by any user for the specific use case. And then these can become very capable, right? Maybe near peer to what's best out there. So that's also possible.
Yeah, no, I don't think fine tuning can make them as good as proprietary models. Yeah, maybe for certain use cases, they can be. But yeah, so you can think of it as an underlying layer which gives certain base capabilities for any country which has them, right? And you would want that ideally, rather than being in a world where this is just being with one country.
And it also ties very well to the idea that, Jeffrey Ding's idea of diffusion and how diffusion has come to define all the great power transitions we've had in past, and why, even if, let's say, if your country is able to better diffuse something that is not the cutting edge, but still gives you a baseline capability, then embed that in all your industries, all your economic sectors very well, then you'll get good national power coming out of it. And you'll enhance your national power.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good note to also bring our discussion to conclusion. Thank you so much, Pranay, for joining in. And listeners, if you have any questions for us, if you disagree with Pranay's view on this, or if you think Indian interests are different, please feel free to reach out to us and write to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.